What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron, and today we're going to talk about my top 12 players for fantasy football in 2024. This is how I think the first round of your fantasy draft should go. Now, I will say, all of these players are first rounders for a reason. They're all very good players. I don't need to explain why Christian McCaffrey is a first round pick. So, we're going to put a little bit of a twist on this video, where for every one of these first round picks, we're going to talk about the ceiling and the floor. What is the absolute worst case scenario? What is the best case scenario for these players to win leagues and dominate, or to ruin your fantasy football championship odds in 2024, and give you guys the full scope of what these players can be. So as always, if you enjoy, make sure down below, subscribe, leave a like. Let's go.
VVS stones, like this froze, ice cold, ice around my body like I'm frozen. She gon' let me.
Now, first up, we're going to talk about Christian McCaffrey as my 101. Now, maybe in a month or so, I might cool off of McCaffrey at 101 and put somebody else here. But for now, I'm fine with McCaffrey. When we talk about his ceiling and floor, the ceiling is the roof with McCaffrey, where last year he went out there and did it again. He gave us a legendary running back season, something we haven't had since McCaffrey did it in like 2019. Or I guess you could kind of say 2020 with Alvin Kamara, but even still, McCaffrey gave us a vintage running back season that we only see from like fantasy football Hall of Famers, guys like Breece Hall and LaDainian Tomlinson and all of those greats. And with McCaffrey, since he was drafted in 2017, he has given us 3 of the top 10 point per game seasons by a running back, with 29 points per game in 2019, 24 points per game in 2018, and then 24 points per game again last year in 2023, which is just absolutely bonkers that he did that last year, seemingly out of nowhere, right? He had a pretty good year where he was like half with the Panthers, half with the 49ers, and then last year, he dominated. Last year, it was him, it was Kyren Williams, the only 2 running backs with 20 or more points per game, and then after that, it was a bunch of guys with like 17 to 18 points per game. He just absolutely lapped the field. And even still, in his older age, with all the volume in the world, he led all running backs in expected points per game. That's just his volume based on his carries, targets, red zone opportunities. He had 4.2 fantasy points over expected per game. So even though he had all the volume in the world, he was still superseding that volume, giving us efficiency, giving us touchdowns. He led the NFL in red zone carries. He led the NFL in volume. He's still in the Kyle Shanahan offense. So he could just be this smash pick all over again, where he, again, laps the field at running back. Running back is as weak as it's ever been, and McCaffrey's at the top of that totem pole by a very wide margin. Now, when we talk about the floor of McCaffrey, right, the ceiling is obviously number 1 player overall in fantasy football. The floor is a little bit tougher, and this is why he wouldn't be your first overall pick in some cases, because some people might value floor a little bit more, right? You don't want to completely swing and miss on your first overall pick in fantasy football. And the floor case for McCaffrey is really that running backs, especially later on in their career, suffer from injury. We know from Pat Kareem, we've mentioned this article every single offseason. We're going to mention it again this offseason, but running backs drafted in the first round bust at a much higher rate than wide receivers taken there. And that is because running backs are getting hurt at a higher rate. I went back and looked since 2021. So over the last 3 years, the rate at which top 24 ADP running backs and wide receivers missed 4 or more games. When we look at the statistics, it doesn't really look like a big difference, right? 35% for running backs, 26% for wide receivers, but that means running backs are about a third more likely to get hurt for 4 or more games than wide receivers, 1.35x that of wide receivers. When you look at that over an entire sample, that does add up. And then on top of that, we have McCaffrey, who is heading into his year 8 season. We know running backs kind of age like dogs. We're talking dog years here. We're talking like Todd Gurley fell off a cliff. Le'Veon Bell fell off a cliff. Not that that's going to happen to McCaffrey, but it's certainly in the range of outcomes, where last year he even had some bumps and bruises with a calf strain, an oblique strain. You had in 2021, he missed time. 2020, he missed time. And we have seen with age curves, shout out to Ryan Heath. This is an amazing article that I reference all the time, where he looked at age curves and sort of how running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, all of that, how they progress over time. And he found that in year 8 for running backs, that's when you see a big decline. And you can see there with that last line from Ryan Heath, from year 8 on, running backs are usually worse off than they were as rookies. So this could be where we see a dip. Even if it's not injury, we could see a dip where he goes from that like 24 point per game, light the league on fire type production down to like maybe 18 to 20 points per game. And he just gives you what his volume gives you, sort of like a late career Ezekiel Elliott with the Cowboys. So that's the lower range. He could get hurt. He could give you just 18 to 20 points per game, which is still good. But the ceiling, of course, is number 1 overall guy in fantasy football. Now, our second player here, my 102, is Ceedee Lamb. And his ceiling case is pretty easy. It's what it was last year. He could just be the wide receiver 1 overall again, and he could be the engine of what was a top 5 offense in 2024. We've seen Dak Prescott, I believe for like the last 3 years, this offense has been top 5 in pretty much all passing metrics. When you have the number 1 guy that is the engine of that passing offense, you usually get good things in fantasy football. Now, the reason that I have him at 102 and not 101 is because McCaffrey just gives you such a crazy positional advantage. Now, McCaffrey actually had more points per game than Ceedee Lamb. Ceedee Lamb also, with wide receivers, we had 5 wide receivers over 20 points per game. With running backs, you had just 2. And even with those 2, McCaffrey was way above Kyren Williams. So he just gives you a edge that no other team can replicate at the running back position, whereas with Ceedee Lamb, you're going to have a few wide receivers in that 20-plus point per game area. It's just kind of what the modern NFL has been. But the floor is really high with Ceedee Lamb, where he's in this Cowboys offense. The Cowboys offense is going to be good through the air as long as Dak Prescott's there. And really the only thing that can happen to him, I don't want to just talk about injury for every single player. So with Ceedee Lamb, we could just see his efficiency go down, where this is EP per game, so that's just your expected points based on your volume, your air yards, all of that, and your FPOE per game, so your fantasy points over expected per game. Last year, he was number 3 in FPOE per game among wide receivers with 5.1. The previous years, he was at 2.7 and 1.8. If his 18.9 expected points per game reverted back to 1.8 FPOE per game, he'd be at like just over 20 points per game. So that's a really high floor. We're talking about like worst case scenario efficiency wise with that volume that he saw last year. He would be like right at 20 points a game instead of like flirting with 24 points a game as like a league winner. But that's still a great consolation prize and why he's my 102. Then we have Tyreek Hill, who's a really interesting one, because I really do think Tyreek has a genuine case for 101 in PPR formats if you wanted to put him there. He is in a Mike McDaniel offense that has been top 5 in passing yards and passing touchdowns each of the last 2 years that Mike McDaniel has been there. And with Tyreek Hill, before injury, he was outscoring McCaffrey. He was outscoring every quarterback. He was the number 1 player in fantasy football until he got hurt. And he got hurt in week 12. That's when it first picked up, this ankle soreness, and then he left week 14 early, and then he didn't play in week 15. If we look just through week 13, we're talking 26.1 points per game. Look at how monstrous those game logs were. 44 points in week 1, 30 in week 3, 30 again in week 5. Then four straight 25 pieces, then a 30 bomb in week 11. Like, he was going nuts as the number 1 player in fantasy. Then he tweaks his ankle, misses week 15, and then that kind of just screws up the way the rest of his season went. But if you just look through the first 13 weeks, right, pretty much prior to the fantasy football playoffs, Tyreek Hill was in a league of his own in terms of a fantasy asset. And you can see this as like things kind of decline towards the end, but the big thing to sort of see with Tyreek Hill is even early on, those snap shares are low, right? He's under 70% snap share versus Denver, versus the Giants, versus Carolina, versus the Chargers as well. And all of those games came against bad opponents, where it was almost, if you guys remember what happened with T. Higgins at Clemson, where in the second half of games, Tyreek Hill just wasn't needed. He would just come off the field and they would coast by a lot of these games. And I thought Josh Norris did a really good job of covering this, where he said Tyreek Hill scored only 3 second half touchdowns in 2023. You can see the split of the stats here, where he had 680 yards and 3 touchdowns in the second half, as opposed to 1,100 yards and 10 touchdowns in the first half. So they really took their foot off the gas pedal in the second half, and we could see much more competitive game scripts here for the Dolphins. I thought Jacob Gibbs outlined it really well here, where now they have a new defensive coordinator, Miami's 3rd DC in the last 3 years. You also have some look-ahead lines where the Dolphins are implied for the 4th most points. You can read through the rest here, and pretty much, or the last sentence here is actually good to look at. The Dolphins were playing with a lead on 50% of offensive drives in 2023. Only the 49ers, Ravens, and Lions had a higher rate. Miami was one of 4 teams to play with a double-digit lead on 50-plus separate drives, and one of 2 to play with a 20-plus point lead on 20-plus different drives. As a result, we saw Miami run the ball an abnormal amount. The Dolphins ranked 17th in pass rate on the year, but their rate when leading or trailing by 6 or fewer points was the 3rd highest at 63%. So they were actually passing a lot in neutral situations, but they just kept on really beating up on bad teams, especially early on in the year. So now we have a spot where we get a new defensive coordinator. We get Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips off of like ACL and Achilles injuries. You get Christian Wilkins getting poached by the Raiders. And this defense could take a step back. You could get more competitive game scripts. And then all of a sudden, if Tyreek Hill puts on that same performance he does in the first half as he does in the second half, we could see him finally, I know it was his goal last year to hit like 2,000 receiving yards or whatever. We could finally see that happening. So that's absolutely massive. Now, with the floor with Tyreek Hill, it's much shakier than a Ceedee Lamb because we have a guy who's now going to be 30 years old, and we do have injuries here where we had an ankle soreness in 2023, a bruised hand. He was coming out of games early, a hip strain in week 8. You had a quad strain in 2022, quad strain as well in week 6. And this is just what happens as you get older. Players deteriorate. Again, he's 30 years old. And then you can also go as far as saying, well, Tyreek Hill's calling card is unmatched speed. Well, now that you're 30 and you're getting older, your fast twitch muscles start to deteriorate a little bit. And we could see that gets zapped from him, whereas like game-breaking upside isn't there anymore, and he's more of like what Devontae Adams kind of is right now on the Raiders, as just a running back like a little bit past, or a wide receiver a little bit past his prime, that'll give you okay numbers, but not just like this scorched earth 26 point per game type of production. Now, I don't think this is going to happen for sure, but it's 100% in his range of outcomes as an older player in fantasy football. Now, at the 104, we have Justin Jefferson. And this is more of a talent play, and it's more of a floor play with Jefferson, just because we know he's one of the best wide receivers in football. He has 2 straight 20-point-per-game seasons in fantasy football. He had a 20-point-per-game season last year in a season that came with just 5 games of Kirk Cousins. The other 5 were with a mix of Mullins. Who else did they have? They had Dobbs. They even had 1 game of the kid from BYU that I'm blanking on even knowing his name right now, but his 2024 season is going to come down to quarterback play. We have no more Kirk Cousins. We have Sam Darnold. We have J.J. McCarthy, a rookie. Now, you can look at it one of 2 ways. The first way, which highlights the ceiling, is the way Hayden Winks put it here, where you look at the 4 games without Kirk Cousins post-injury for Justin Jefferson. He was on a pace of 128 catches, 2,023 yards, and 8 touchdowns. That would be a scorched earth bonker season. But on the other hand, when we talk about his worst case scenario and his floor, it gets shakier because you're putting your top 5 fantasy football pick in the hands of Sam Darnold and J.J. McCarthy, which is a little bit scary here. When we look at Sam Darnold, who, I'm a Jets fan. I like Sam Darnold, but since 2021, so not even including the Adam Gase Jets years, since he's left the Jets, of 43 qualifying quarterbacks, he is 37th in EPA per play, which is just quarterback efficiency. That's awful. Now, maybe J.J. McCarthy comes in and he does better, but the issue with J.J. McCarthy is going to be volume, where unless it be C.J. Stroud, it's going to be tough to keep Jefferson in that like wide receiver 1 overall category. Last year, the Vikings had 256 passing yards per game, and you can see this is every rookie quarterback ever with I think 100 pass attempts, or no, 7 starts or more. Every rookie quarterback ever with 7 starts or more. Only 5 quarterbacks ever have had over 256 passing yards per game, which is what the Vikings had last year. And you can see after Cam Newton, Jameis Winston, it starts to really fall off there, where then you're talking Mariota at 230, Daniel Jones at 230, Dak at 229. You have Sam Darnold at 220, which is all fine, but your passing efficiency, your passing volume is all going to suffer under a rookie quarterback. So it kind of comes down to what you think Kevin O'Connell can do with these quarterbacks. I have a lot of faith in Kevin O'Connell, but also these quarterbacks are just letting him down. And it could be kind of a rich man's version of what Garrett Wilson and Drake London have been the last 2 years, with just bad quarterback play and a bad offense. He could find himself in a similar spot where he's stuck with bad quarterback play. It just is what it is. And instead of having that 20, 22, 24 point per game upside, he stalls out at like 18 points per game as just a fine wide receiver one, which is fine, but not something you want to spend your top 5 pick on. Then we have Ja'Marr Chase at the 105. And for me, the ceiling is pretty easy. We're now 3 years into the Ja'Marr Chase's career, and we're yet to have that monstrous season that we've thought he could have since he came out of college after his rookie year, and he went absolutely bonkers. He's now had, I believe, like a 20 point per game season. He's never finished outside the top 12 point per game wide receivers as well, so he has a very high floor. He's shown everything in terms of talent. It's just a matter of it all coming together for one season. Now we finally have a season. No Tyler Boyd to steal targets away. Their RB1 is Zach Moss, so they're not married to the running game at all. And they added Trent Brown to their offensive line. So now they have Trent Brown and Orlando Brown Jr. I'm not an offensive line guru, but I believe that those guys are like super, super big pass protecting tackles to protect Joe Burrow, give him all the time in the world. And if all of that can sync up perfectly in one given year, Ja'Marr Chase could go nuclear wide receiver one overall season. We know Ja'Marr Chase is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when for him, and why not in year 4. Now, the why not, the floor here that I'm a little bit spooked on isn't even Ja'Marr Chase's fault. It's Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow had this injury where he tore like a ligament in his thumb or his wrist, which is, I mean, as a quarterback in your throwing hand, your wrist, something that you're snapping on every single throw, is concerning. And I wanted to show you guys this tweet from Dr. Jesse Morris, sort of regarding what the injury has in store. He said, Joe Burrow suffered a season-ending injury. I don't even know what this is. It's a right ligament tear in his throwing wrist on November 16th against the Ravens. Initially, it was suspected that it was a TFCC complex tear, but unfortunately it was worse. It was the dreaded other complex tear. The ligament is very important for the stability of the wrist, and since this/most ligaments have a poor blood supply, it needed to be repaired. I asked an orthopedic hand surgeon colleague his thoughts on this injury as it pertains to Burrow, and here was his response. It's a bad injury to have, invariably always lead to some instability over time and arthritis at an earlier age. 80% of normal strength and range of motion is common. Hard to do dart thrower's motion, which is important for snapping the wrist and the follow-through when throwing. But these guys are superhuman, so I'm sure he'll be fine. Did this injury change his career forever? Yes, for sure. For context, he's the only pro quarterback I've heard of with this, so it's hard to gauge. Use this information as you wish. He should be cleared to throw by mid-May on par with OTAs, which is on track, assuming no setbacks. Will he ever be the same quarterback he was before the injury? Unfortunately, we don't know, although I can say he is at increased risk for new compensating injuries. Now, none of that sounds great. Now, I will say he should be on track. We haven't really heard anything scary out of camp, but we have an injury here, and as a numbers guy, I like a sample size. There is a sample size of 0. We have no other quarterbacks that have had this injury in the past. It's on his throwing hand. It's a pretty brutal rehab. They're saying like 80% of what he was before, and everybody's just like, okay, we're all fine. Now, that's all to say, Ja'Marr Chase is still my 105. He's not in this area where I'm not drafting him at all, but there is reason to be spooked. And again, not on Ja'Marr Chase's side, but that Joe Burrow might not have the same flick of the wrist that he had before. And this was already a guy who came into the NFL with arm strength concerns. If they dial that back even more, Ja'Marr Chase is a guy who loves to win downfield. That is concerning. We also have the other thing where Joe Burrow loves to start out slow. And in best ball, sure, you can get away with it. But if he starts slow again, if you drafted Ja'Marr Chase last year, you felt it, where you did not have a first-round pick through those first 4 weeks. And you could have started 0-4, 1-3, and that's just a really bad spot to put yourself in because your first-round pick starts slow. Last year, Joe Burrow was 30th in EPA per play, 34th in completion percentage over expected, 23rd in PFF pass grade, 32nd in completion percentage. He was just awful across the board weeks 1-4. Then last year, he turned it around weeks 5-10, where you can see here with Ian Hartitz, first in completion percentage over expected, 7th in EPA per dropback, 6th in PFF passing grade. But by then, it wasn't too little too late, but it kind of was, because then after that, Joe Burrow gets hurt, and all of the Bengals flopped last year. That's the concern here again, that they start slow like they did with the calf injury last year. Maybe he does that again with the wrist, and then, like Dr. Jesse Morris said, there could be complications that happen from compensating for the wrist. He could just not be the same player, and then that is also another scary situation where they could start slow. It could never get better. Maybe by the time it does get better, it doesn't matter anymore. You're already 0-4, 0-5. Maybe by the time it does get better, he gets hurt again. There's just a lot of downside with an injury that we just don't have a large sample size on. So that is why Ja'Marr Chase is my 105, and that is the worst case scenario for him. Now, at 106, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. And with him, he has a very high floor, but the ceiling is tough for me to see as like a slot lower ADOT guy. He had a 30% target share last year. He had 10 touchdowns, which for a guy who is the slot receiver and on a team with like Laporta and on a team that runs the ball a lot inside of the red zone, 10 touchdowns is probably like about a reasonable ceiling for him. 30% target share, and he was even better after his injury. So I have a hard time being like, oh, well, his oblique tear. I know that we got reports that it like tore off the bone from the Receivers show on Netflix, but I have a tough time saying, well, he can do even more than that. I mean, maybe he could, but we still got just over 20 points per game last year in a Ben Johnson offense when he had 10 touchdowns, 30% target share. I don't know where else the efficiency would come from. I don't think that he can get more targets. 10 touchdowns, it feels like that's kind of maxed out. I mean, maybe he can get some yak and he just has like a monster after the catch season, but that's not really his game. He's kind of more a possession guy. So, again, we're sort of splitting hairs here. Anything over 20 points per game is a huge win. I just don't – here's kind of how I'll put it. I don't know. I don't see a world where Amon-Ra St. Brown is the 101 in 2025. Now, I know that that's like a really almost like unfair expectation, but when we're talking about the ceiling of a top 6 overall pick, you want the upside that he's the first overall pick in that following year. That's usually a good gauge of this guy was an amazing fantasy pick if he's the first overall pick in the next year. Like with McCaffrey, right? McCaffrey was like a first-round pick last year, first overall pick this year. I have a tough time seeing how that is with Amon-Ra St. Brown, but again, we're splitting hairs. But the floor is super high, and that's why I have him at 6th overall. Detroit added nothing to their wide receiver room. Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be healthier after the oblique thing last year. And really the only downside is similar to Ceedee Lamb, where it's just like a small downside where 17.4 expected points per game last year, wide receiver 5. FPOE per game was 3.6, wide receiver 7. That could revert back to his year 1 and 2 numbers where he was like 1.1 to 1.4, and that would put him at more like 19 points per game instead of like 20 or 21 points per game, which again, fine wide receiver 1, fine first round pick. So his floor is very high, but I also just don't know how he gets to first overall in 2025. Now this next player does have a shot at being first overall in 2025, someone that I'm very high on is Breece Hall. Now, before we get into the rest of Breece Hall, I did want to tell you guys to make sure you check out Underdog Fantasy. You can draft guys like Breece Hall. You can use these rankings as well. I have those over on the Patreon, patreon.com/Ron Stewart. You can find this, Underdog links, all of that in the description in the comment section down below. I have rankings that you can upload straight to Underdog, and you can hop on Underdog, get ready for your home league draft. They have $5 drafts right now, $100,000 to first place. The puppy is live here. So if you use promo code Ron, you get your deposit matched up to $250. You get a special pick'em in the pick'em lobby, and you can hop into these puppies, get some practice for your home leagues, get some skin in the game, use my rankings while you're doing it as well, and just get a feel for where players should be drafted in 2024 this summer. Now, with that being said, we have Breece Hall. And Breece Hall's ceiling is pretty simple. His ceiling is first overall in 2025 as the RB1 overall in 2024. He has had so far an RB6 point per game finish and an RB7 point per game finish as a rookie, as a guy coming off an ACL tear, as a guy with pretty brutal offenses in general. And Warren Sharp sums it up really well here, where Breece Hall, in his 2 seasons, he's been behind the number 30 and the number 29 offensive line and run block win rate, the number 31 and the number 31 O-line and injury rate, the worst collective quarterback room in the NFL. He tore his ACL, meniscus, and he rehabbed, and he had hamstring and ankle injuries, yet he gained the second most total yards last year behind only Christian McCaffrey. The last 2 years, his per-game net yardage ranks number 6 among running backs. He averaged the number 4 highest rate of 15-plus yard gains and the number 5 highest rate of 20-plus yard gains. In each game, he averaged 2.75 gains of 10 or more yards, number 3 in the NFL behind only McCaffrey and Nick Chubb. He is a monster. And with the explosive plays, with the amazing running stats, he still gives you monstrous receiving numbers. Last year, he had the best PFF receiving grade, the most targets, the most receptions, and the most receiving yards among all running backs last year. That is huge. We need that receiving upside to have an RB1 overall finish like we saw McCaffrey last year, and that is something that Breece Hall can give you. Now, with all of that, we have what he's done in the past in city situations. The ceiling is that the situation improves. We get Aaron Rodgers presumably healthy off the Achilles tear, and we get a revamped offensive line here as outlined by Establish the Run, a top 10 overall unit. Now at the bottom here, I'm not going to read the entire thing. This is a unit with a high ceiling due to their talent and pedigree, but somewhat of a fragile floor due to there being enough age and durability concerns to call into question their ability to sustain that level of play for the majority of the season. So that's the ceiling. RB1 overall, he finally gets the quarterback, the offensive efficiency and touchdowns. He gets the offensive line. Everything falls into place for him to have a monster season. The floor is shaky, as it is with most running backs. As we talked about the bust rate earlier on, this offensive line, as Established the Run says here, is fragile. Aaron Rodgers, 40-year-old quarterback off an Achilles tear, is fragile. We also have Nathaniel Hackett, one of the worst play callers in the entire league, could ruin the entire offense. He could also make this a weird timeshare where we always complain that Aaron Jones was never fully unleashed in Green Bay. He could see that as a similar thing here where Breece Hall is his Aaron Jones and it holds him back from ever having that truly legendary upside type season of like 24 points per game like McCaffrey had last year because they drafted 2 running backs in this year's draft. And on day 3, they drafted Braylon Allen. They drafted Isaiah Davis. Braylon Allen, a guy who's getting rave reviews out of camp, 235 pounds and could be used as a goal line hammer. So if we get somebody taking away and vulturing goal line opportunities, that could be ugly as well. So there's a lot of things that could go wrong. We're also drafting 2 Jets players in the first round, a team that hasn't made the playoffs since Mark Sanchez was there. There is a lot that can go wrong. It's a very, very fragile setup. So that's why I have him as my 107. You could talk me into higher, but the floor is very low. Now, next up we have Bijan as my 108. And his ceiling, like Breece Hall, is RB1 in all of fantasy. We finally have competent coaching in Atlanta. We finally have a quarterback with Kirk Cousins. And Zach Robinson is the offensive coordinator. He comes from the Rams, who have produced fantasy football studs, right? We've had Todd Gurley. We've had Kyron Williams. Even before that, you've had guys like Malcolm Brown just like fill in and be really good. Same with like Cam Akers. Darrell Henderson's another one where he would just find these running backs and make them bell cows. The Rams scheme makes the RB1 just the bell cow workhorse, kind of just like old style football that we saw in like the 2010s for fantasy football. And that's the exciting part. Now, when talking about Christian McCaffrey, this is from Coach Speak Index. They are great on Twitter. Robinson said, Bijan's such a talented player. He's going to play running back first and foremost, and then any way we can find creative ways to get him the ball like the Niners do with McCaffrey is exactly right. So we're talking about potential McCaffrey, Gurley type usage. We're talking a top 10 offensive line, better quarterback play, competent coaching. We also had a running back in Bijan Robinson that was 3rd in targets last year with 83. So the receiving upside is there. Everything is there. And we know with year 2 running backs, thanks to Ryan Heath, year 2, you can see on this chart, generally running back takes a big step forward from year 1 to year 2. That is where we're at with Bijan Robinson. He will build off of his first year, and that could be special. Now, in terms of his worst case scenario, you have a couple here where Kirk Cousins also off the Achilles tear. I mean, Achilles tears are just brutal to come back from. He could not be the same guy. We could then, maybe he gets re-injured when you have Michael Penix. You have a rookie quarterback with a first-year play caller, right? He was with the Rams, Zach Robinson, probably listed as a offensive coordinator, but really Sean McVay is calling the plays. So it's going to be a rookie play caller with a rookie quarterback. That's scary. You also have Tyler Algier there who could vulture a lot more than we'd like. He's one of the best running back backups in the league. He could take a lot of goal line looks. He could take a lot of short yardage stuff, and that would be bad as well. Now, our number 9 player is A.J. Brown, the 109. And here I actually want to start with the floor for A.J. Brown. The floor is very, very high, and I actually kind of think that talent drives floor at wide receiver, especially in like suboptimal situations. We have A.J. Brown here through his entire career, outside of his rookie year and then his 3rd year when he had injury problems. He has never finished outside the top 8 wide receivers in points per game. He's been the wide receiver 8 in back-to-back years for the Eagles. We also have, on a per-route basis, A.J. Brown is an alien on a per-route basis. I was looking at it the other day. He was 3rd in yards per route run in 2019, 3rd in 2020, 8th in 2021, 3rd in 2022, 9th in 2023. His career number is 2.58 yards per route run. That is a top 10 number in almost any given year, and that is just his career baseline. He is a monster. And I think that David at DSP4150 actually summed it up well with this reply. He's a top 3 to 5 wide receiver talent in the league, and we likely never see the team-level pass volume for the guy unique season that he so deserves. So he's another one like Amon-Ra St. Brown. I don't know how we get to a spot where A.J. Brown is like in first overall pick contention for 2025 drafts next year because of his team. It's not because of talent. He is one of the best wide receivers in the league as shown by his yards per out run, but the issue is going to be that his ceiling is capped because he's in a low-volume pass offense again. This has sort of just been the story of his career. This is a guy that has never even hit 18-plus points per game, never mind 20-plus points per game, which is what we really need for that massive ceiling. So he's more of a floor player. When we talk about the ceiling, it is capped. It's not his fault, but it is what it is. We look throughout his entire career. He's never been on a team that is even ranked inside the top 20 in pass attempts per game. And I showed here with Mike Clay's 2024 projections. He actually hasn't projected for his best season yet at 18.1 points per game, but that still would have been just flirting with like top 6 point per game numbers last year. And even with that, they were 26 in pass attempts, 21st in passing yards, 19th in passing touchdowns in Clay's projection. So another year of a low volume passing offense, and all of their moves this offseason points to that. They go out there and they get Saquon Barkley, which means they're going to want to lean on the run more. And this is an offense with Nick Sirianni that we've seen when they had Shane Steichen. They want to run the ball in close, whether that's tush push, whether that's Saquon Barkley carry. This is not a team looking to run an A.J. Brown slant or an A.J. Brown fade within 5 yards of the goal line. They want to punch it in. So it's just tough. You know, the volume's not going to be there. The touchdowns aren't going to be there. But he's still my 109 because the floor is so high. Things would have to go horribly wrong for him not to finish as a wide receiver 1 in points per game. But you'd have to thread in a crazy, crazy needle for him to hit like 20-plus points per game and be like the wide receiver 1 overall in a given year, even though he has the talent to do so. Now, at the 110, we have Puka Nacua. He is at the 110. He is coming off one of the craziest rookie years of all time. When we look at just PPR points for a rookie wide receiver all time, it's Randy Moss, it's Ja'Marr Chase, Puka, OBJ, Anquan Bolden, Justin Jefferson. He is on a monster list, and his ceiling is just that in a Sean McVay offense that produced bonkers numbers with Cooper Kupp a couple of years ago, he is the next in line. The heir apparent, he is the next Cooper Kupp in this offense, and he improves on his monster rookie year the same way Justin Jefferson and Ja'Marr Chase did. After their big rookie years, they then had their first 20-plus point per game seasons in year 2, and especially after last year, Puka Nacua only had 6 touchdowns. It's very easy. If he was to just double those touchdowns, he'd be at 20-plus points per game. So it's very easy to talk yourself into how does he get to that ceiling? It comes via touchdowns, and then he gets to 20-plus points per game. But we talk about the floor, it's a little bit tougher. I don't think that his floor is really that high because when I looked at my database and we sort by the best point per game seasons all time for rookie wide receivers, it's not always a given that they actually do better in year 2. Fantasy football and just like football in general is not linear, right? We've seen it with other guys in the past, like Chase Claypool, monster year 1, sort of fell off. We've seen it with guys, I'm trying to think of another one, but you see guys all the time where they peak early. Juju Smith-Schuster peak early, and then, he doesn't keep going. Like Odell Beckham Jr., we thought he was going to be a Hall of Famer, and then things fall off. And of this list of about 8 wide receivers that have had 15-plus points per game in their rookie year, only 4 of them improved on that number. OBJ had a worse points per game in his second year. Michael Thomas had a worse points per game. Mike Evans had a worse points per game. Brandon Ayuk had a worse points per game. Jalen Waddle had a worse points per game. So it's not always a given that these players build on that season. Then we also have the threat of Cooper Kupp, where Cooper Kupp only played like 12 games last year. He wasn't at full strength. And if he comes into this season healthy and the guy that we think that he could be, that's not good for Puka Nacua. Last year, the splits with and without Cooper Kupp were telling for Puka Nacua. Now, I will say, even still, 15.7 points per game in games with Cooper Kupp is still one of the best rookie seasons of all time, right? Like, that is still Jalen Waddle, Brandon Ayuk rookie year numbers. It's just not quite Jefferson Chase numbers, which he had 20-plus points per game without Kupp. So those are the two downsides of it's not always linear. You don't always improve on your rookie year. And then also Cooper Kupp could come into the season fully healthy and be a legitimate thorn in the side of Puka Nacua, hitting that like monstrous ceiling. Then we have Garrett Wilson as my 111 here. And his ceiling is pretty simple. His ceiling is like early prime Davante Adams with Aaron Rodgers as like Aaron Rodgers' number one wide receiver, go-to red zone target. There's no card competition, right? You have like Mike Williams, who is off an ACL and not going to be playing a bunch, Allen Lazard, Tyler Conklin, and like Breece Hall, who Breece Hall's going to have some targets, but not wide receiver type of targets. So Garrett Wilson's going to have all the volume in the world, and if this offense can be better with an Aaron Rodgers, that's going to do wonders for him as a guy that is a monster in the red zone. He, among active players or among active wide receivers, according to Jacob Gibbs here, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th in end zone target share leaders over the last 2 years. So I believe that is from his rookie season, or since his rookie season. Garrett Wilson has been a monster at those end zone targets, and that is a huge, huge deal because in this Nate Hackett offense, we have seen he passes the ball in the red zone a ton. Last year, despite having Zach Wilson, Boyle, Simeon as his quarterbacks, he still passed the ball at the highest rate in the NFL inside of the 10-yard line. And this is something that he's done dating back to his Green Bay days, where in the red zone, he was 4th, 7th, and 1st in pass rate over expected on Green Bay. So in close, on the goal line, he loves to pass the ball. Aaron Rodgers did that at 2 with Davante Adams, where you'd have a lot of these like motion and quick slants and just ways to scheme your playmaker the ball open in the end zone. Garrett Wilson has legitimate 10-plus touchdown upside, and we could finally see him in a functional offense being able to show off his skills. This is a great tweet from Ted Seth here, where among 120 qualifying receivers, Garrett Wilson was 53rd in yards per route run, which doesn't seem great, but his teammates were 112th and 113th. So compared to his teammates, he was far and above the best. And then in ESPN's open score, so this is player tracking, how often are you getting open? He was 5th at ESPN open score. His teammates ranked 140th, 143rd, and 145th. He was the best player on this team by far and away. He had a 30% target share last year, which was 7th among wide receivers. So he gets open, he commands targets. All he needs is a real offense. Now, the floor, the worst case scenario, is pretty much what we said for Breece, right? We have Aaron Rodgers off an Achilles. You have Nathaniel Hackett, who's an incompetent coach. You have a fragile offensive line with a guy in Tyron Smith who hasn't played a full season since 2015. You have Elijah Vera Tucker, who they're counting on at guard, who is coming off an Achilles tear. Everything is very fragile with this team, and it's not that hard to look up and be like, man, 2 Jets going in the first round of fantasy drafts, they haven't been good since Rex Ryan. So a lot at stake, a lot of risk with these Jets players, but there is a lot to be gained from drafting them. Then at number 12, our last pick here, we have Jahmyr Gibbs at 112. And again, same thing with the running back chart like we talked about with Bijan Robinson. Year 2 running backs, usually that's where they really pop off. You remember a guy like Christian McCaffrey? He was pretty good in year 1, but then he went nuclear in his second year. That was that 24-point-per-game season in 2018. That was his second year in Carolina. We could see the same thing for Jahmyr Gibbs this season. In terms of his ceiling, he was RB8 in points per game last year, and that was despite being in a real timeshare with David Montgomery, and he still outproduced a guy like Bijan Robinson, who had way more touches than him. And then he wasn't even fully unleashed until like week 7, where he had 86% of the snaps. And then from week 7 on, he was the RB4 in points per game with 18.5 points per game. And again, that was in a real timeshare. And his calling card, and the reason why we were so high on Gibbs and why we liked him a ton in Dynasty, because of his receiving upside. And he didn't even really get to show that off last year, which tells me that there is a lot of untapped ceiling. Ian Hart has tweeted here, Gibbs in 2023 actually had similar receiving numbers to Ezekiel Elliott. So even with 52 catches, which is a lot, he wasn't super efficient, which I think obviously is going to build on. In terms of the running game, he was one of the most electric rushers in football last year. That is going to come for him in the receiving game. Then we have another tweet kind of highlighting this. Jahmyr Gibbs had 57 receiving yards from week 12 on last year. Chase Brown on one screen had 54 receiving yards last year. So I think because that was his calling card, he actually had 104 receptions in college, which was more than McCaffrey, more than Saquon had in college. Again, he is one of the best receiving running back prospects I've ever seen. And in year 2, I think that's where we're going to see that unlocked. So if he can get to 80-plus catches and then also add a bunch of explosive plays and efficiency on those catches, we're talking about a guy that can have 20-plus points per game and flirt with like RB1 overall numbers. I do think, though, in terms of like monstrous ceiling, I don't know that he gets to RB1 overall like McCaffrey did with 24 points per game without a David Montgomery injury. Now, in terms of the floor is actually great with Gibbs. Outside of an injury, as running backs are predisposed to, not counting injury, he has probably one of the highest floors in the first round, where Jahmyr Gibbs, we saw last year, even in a timeshare with David Montgomery. This is a great tweet from Wolf of Roto Street, where you can see Jahmyr Gibbs is 22nd in total opportunities. He was 28th in carries, and yet all of that, he finished 8th in fantasy points per game. He tied with Kyren Williams and Breece Hall for top 5 finishes, and he was RB3 in fantasy points after returning from his injury. And again, that was in a legitimate timeshare with David Montgomery. So you have Ben Johnson. He's going to score points. You have a top 10 offensive line. Outside of Laporte and Amon-Ra St. Brown, you have an unproven Jameson Williams, and that's it. So the receiving upside is there for him. The offensive environment is there for him. And even if it's a bigger timeshare between him and Montgomery than we want, that's still going to be enough to lock him in for mid-range RB1 numbers, which is a pretty good floor to have in the first round for a running back. Now, that is going to do it for us today. As always, I appreciate you guys watching. You can find all of my rankings over on patreon.com/Ron Stewart. You can also find $250 in bonus credits over on Underdog Fantasy if you are new there. Make sure you use promo code Ron. They'll match your first deposit up to $250 when you join Underdog Fantasy and you use promo code Ron. And you can hop in drafts already and use my uploadable rankings from Patreon. But as always, hope you guys enjoyed that video. That is how I see the first round of fantasy drafts. I think that we're going to do a lot of rankings videos this week, or like over the next 10 days, where I want to talk about the top 40, probably do like the top 30 running backs, the top 30 wide receivers, and just kind of put some early rankings out there. And then we'll do a final set right before the season kicks off. Hope you guys enjoyed. As always, I will see y'all in the next one.
Stones, like this froze, ice cold, oh, oh.